This year's standard rotation is finally here, and it's one of the most impactful we've ever had. In this video, Jack and I will be covering all the biggest changes you need to know about, what key cards are rotating out, how your favourite decks will be affected, and what the Scarlet and Violet On format might look like going forward. Rotation comes into effect on PTCG Live on March 27th, and in-person tournaments will be post-rotation from the 11th of April. So whether you're looking for the exact impact the rotation will have on the deck you're currently playing, or if you just want to get a head start on testing, we'll be covering it all in our complete guide to the 2025 rotation.
But what do we mean by rotation? The standard format rotation occurs every year, typically in April, in line with the release of the first main set of the year. Pokémon use it as an opportunity to keep the format fresh, making older cards no longer legal for play and forcing new strategies to be thought up and tried out in tournaments. There are usually 4 main sets and 2 subsets that leave standard each year. The sets that leave together are indicated by the legality letter in the bottom right hand corner of the cards. This year, the F block of cards are the ones rotating out, meaning the format will move to Scarlet and Violet On, and we will say goodbye to the remaining Sword and Shield sets. Scarlet and Violet saw a pretty significant shift in card design, with some very powerful evolution Pokemon being printed, and this will be the first time we get to see the vision Creatures Inc. have, setting up for a fully evolution-based format. But before we look too far ahead, let's quickly take a look at what sets we're losing this year. Brilliant Stars is the first set rotating, which introduced us to the V-Star mechanic, with Arceus V-Star. Astral Radiance brought us Radiant Pokemon, some of the most powerful individual Pokemon to be printed. Lost Origin reintroduced the Lost Zone and brought us a brand new skill testing engine that's always been able to adapt to the metagame. Silver Tempest hosted 2 of the most powerful V-Star Pokemon, incredibly divisive, and many will be happy to see them go. And finally, the subsets Pokemon Go and Crown Zenith also rotate, neither of which had huge impact, but both leave standard regardless.
Let's start looking in a bit more detail now then of the strongest attackers that are going to be rotating. Starting with Regidrago V-Star, this has been a dominant archetype for a number of months, to be honest with you. It's a very versatile toolbox of attackers where Regidrago is cherry picking from all of the best dragons that we have in format, giving us high damage option plays, tanking lines, and also great means of taking aggressive spread damage KOs with the likes of Kyurem and also Dragapult EX. With Regidrago V-Star leaving the format, we have to be far less concerned about Kyurem being in the metagame, which is quite fortunate. There aren't many cards that utilise the Chorus's tenacity anymore, especially with Double Turbo Energy also rotating, so I really think we're only going to see the likes of Kyurem in a Slowking-based deck, which is a bit of a rogue archetype, a single prize list that tries to copy this effect for a much cheaper attack cost.
The next big V-Star Pokemon to rotate is Lugia V-Star and its feathery fossilised lackey, Archeops. Lugia has continued to warp the metagame throughout its entire lifespan in the standard format, and has been relevant in pretty much every meta it's been legal in. Beginning with Broken Lugia, the deck had a huge suite of attackers and special energy available, and was dominant until the first rotation post Silver Tempest's release. The deck then shifted to a single strike build, and then most recently the Legacy Energy and Cincino builds that have been consistent top table picks, boasting both high play rates and win rates in the last few tournaments. Lugia had one final buff before rotation from Prismatic Evolutions in Regigigas, and managed to get 10th place at the Vancouver Regional Championships. Lugia, and more importantly Archeops, has really limited design space for special energy that could have been released over the past few years, hence us having very limited Rainbow Energy style effects since its release. With these Pokemon rotating, there should be much more space for interesting special energy to be printed, without the risk of a single archetype dominating tournaments taking advantage of accelerating these from turn 2.
We're also losing Palkia V-Star. This one saw massive success ever since it first came out at the World Championships in 2022. Over the last few months, it's seen more of a supporting role alongside Radiant Greninja to provide some spread pressure for the likes of Golden Go, Chien-Pao, and even Ceruledge lists, giving all of these relatively straightforward beatstick style decks a different dimension with a single prize spread damage option. And that Star Portal V-Star power is the best way to get that turn 2 Greninja online to represent such great pressure.
Next up is the Lost Zone engine, comprised primarily of Comfey, Mirage Gate, and Chorus's Experiment, with Cramorant, Sableye, and Giratina V-Star as frequent supporting cast. The Lost Zone engine has consistently adapted to any metagame it's been featured in, typically in a toolbox style, with attackers slotting into the deck based on countering the most popular decks in the format, all glued together by the power of Mirage Gate as energy acceleration. Giratina V-Star, Hisuian Gudra V-Star, Radiant Greninja, and Radiant Charizard were often seen as the main attackers of the deck upon the release of the engine, but more recently things like Iron Hands EX, Roaring Moon EX, and even Pikachu EX have featured, pairing the best attackers in the game with the most skill testing and rewarding engine available. With the loss of this style of deck, it looks like the new contender for a box-style deck going forward is going to be utilising Ogerpon and Energy Switch, a deck that's already seen huge success in Japan.
We finally get to wave goodbye to Block Snorlax. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be happy about this one, because Snorlax has been the face of a controlling archetype for a decent amount of time now, where many archetypes have to force in extra copies of supporters, pal pads, and switch cards just to respect this one archetype. Even though it's a underplayed deck, it can go far in tournaments. With so many pieces of the Block Snorlax archetype leaving the format, it looks like the go-to option going forward is going to be a Pidgeot EX based attacking controlling deck, or possibly a more walling style approach, utilising frustrating Pokemon like Milotic EX, Cornerstone Ogerpon EX, and possibly even the Farigiraf EX. All packed into one deck to try and find the most annoying attacker for your opponent to deal with, and constantly throw it at them every turn as you try and deal with their answer Pokemon. So it looks like there will be a natural pivot for these controlling players if this is an archetype that you really enjoy to play.
Dialga V-Star is the final notable V-Star Pokemon, a card that was initially relegated to the fun tier. Star Chronos has an incredibly powerful effect, but it took some time for reliable energy acceleration to be printed to help support the Lord of Time. Metang brought the deck some consistency, and it was able to take down a regional championship at the hands of Andrew Hedrick, but it wasn't until the release of Archaladon EX that Dialga saw mainstream success, winning the 5,000 player Champions League tournament in Osaka. It's likely it'll be a while before we see any effect like Dialga's again, given the impact of taking 2 turns, but Archaladon looks to survive in the meantime with a brand new partner to replace Dialga on the horizon.
Radiant Charizard, what an absolutely absurd basic Pokemon here, one of the most powerful single prize attackers ever printed. In its early career, it was a focal point in an Inteleon engine, as well as creating the Sablezard Lost Zone build. But we've seen time and time again the splashability of this card. It's made it into a number of Charizard EX builds, Regidrago V-Star. There's been times where Lugia's even weaved it in. Just a very overstated card for a single prize Pokemon.
The other hugely relevant Radiant Pokemon rotating is Radiant Greninja. Radiant Greninja has proven itself to be one of the most splashable cards of all time, making it into thousands of Day 2 lists on Limitless since its release. Greninja floats between being an attacking threat and a powerful draw engine because it does both brilliantly. It's featured as an attacker in a multitude of different decks such as Lost Zone Box, Giratina V-Star, and Chien-Pao Baxcalibur, but has even seen success alongside things like Palkia V-Star, both as standalone decks and as alternative attacking options in the likes of Ceruledge and Goldengo decks. Most Stage 2 Pokemon, and other decks with low HP basics, have often had to tech Manaphy in just because of Greninja's existence, sometimes being able to win the game with just one well-timed Moonlight Shuriken. However, as mentioned, Greninja wasn't just an attacking threat, with its Concealed Cards ability stitching together many different decks that didn't even play Water Energy, like Gardevoir builds, aggressive archetypes like Roaring Moon and Raging Bolt, and most recently Archaladon EX. Between its ability and its attack, there had to be a very good reason for decks to not play Greninja as their Radiant Pokemon of choice. Going forward, most Stage 2 decks will be pretty pleased to see Greninja go from a defensive standpoint, but aggressive decks take a huge hit in terms of their likelihood of taking KOs early on, as Greninja won't be the only card that limits their dig potential on turn 1 that they have to say goodbye to come April.
Losing Lumineon V on its own is absolutely game-changing. It changes how many supporters we have to play within our decks, and it also makes the one of utility-based supporters far less practical, because you can't use them at the right time without the help of Lumineon finding it out of the deck for you. With that said, it's much more likely that we're going to see bolstered counts, sometimes even just maximum copies, of the likes of Iono, Research, and Arven, rather than having the sort of creative flexibility of lots of one-of supporters within our deck list, unless we go heavy on Pokegears, in addition to the sort of 2 counts of supporters, and simply hope to hit them on crucial turns.
The utility Pokemon Manaphy rotates, meaning there'll be a lack of bench protection for low HP basics other than Buffalant immediately in the format. Terras have built-in bench barrier to help mitigate this, but there isn't much protection for evolving basics going forward as soon as the rotation hits. With Greninja rotating, and Kieran being a lot less oppressive going forward, it's potentially less pressing that we don't have an immediate answer to bench snipe damage, And Shaymin is on the horizon, which will help protect our non-rulebox Pokemon, but there will be a few tournaments where Pokemon like Hopzation may still be able to put pressure on small basic Pokemon.
Rotom, similar to Lumineon V, is another big consistency piece. This one was much more focused towards controlling archetypes that would end their turn on this draw, but additionally Stage 2 decks often look towards this card to get them going after an Arven, where you could go for the Nest Ball plus Forest Sealstone combination to get a Buddy Buddy Poffin as well as end on a +3 cards, helping you get those candy combinations on the second turn of the game. It's quite probable that the majority of Stage 2s, rather than going for Rotom, might look more towards that TM Evolution end of turn setup to get them that little bit closer towards their Stage 2s, and as we know, there's a number of very strong Stage 2 Pokemon that have great draw-based abilities on their Stage 1s, like Dracloak, and these are going to be the best performing Stage 2s going into post-rotation.
Refinement Curlier is a huge loss for Gardevoir, and it completely changes how the archetype looks to be built going forward. Without Curlier and Radiant Greninja, it's now going to be much harder to get energy into the discard pile. This may seem like a nail in Gardevoir's coffin, but as is always the way with rotation, Gardevoir looks like it might survive once more, and we'll talk a little bit later about how lists may look going forward.
Although Bibarel has become a lot less popular in the last few months, it has been one of the best draw engines in the game for a number of formats. I think most recently you can point to some Palkia Noctowl builds that incorporated a thin line of Bibarel just to provide some Iono protection, but even though it's not seeing a huge amount of play right now, it's definitely a big loss. It's one of the best bang for your buck draw cards that we can possibly add into our deck to give ourselves that extra stability, and is universal, with our main alternatives looking at Mew EX and the likes of the Dunsparce coming in, which have their own flaws. Mew is a multi-prize Pokemon and doesn't draw nearly as many cards, so is best in a deck that can thin the hand quite aggressively, and Dunsparce is typically going to require many more deck spaces to get the most out of it.
Onto the items then, and Hisuian Heavy Ball is one of the best prize card interaction items we've ever had. It allowed niche basics to be teched into decks without much downside, and it meant that it was much harder for one player to run away with the game just because the other prized their Radiant. Both Joe and I are going to be really sad to see this one go. It's one of the top cards in our list for the most impactful rotating cards, and was just a real feels-good card to have in the format and one that will be sorely missed.
Lost Vacuum is a really flexible item card. It was very searchable, thanks to Arven of course, and it was a great space cheat because it was able to target both tools and stadium cards in one card. Now, our main means of tool removal come from Jamming Tower, the stadium card, which is generally just less searchable, but also more narrow in that a number of archetypes will require their own tools and then have some anti-synergy if they're trying to utilize the tower themselves. I suppose there's also a small note that there is Solrock and Lunatone in format as well, so if you really want to brute force your tools to work, you can put these Pokemon within your deck so that a Jamming Tower doesn't prevent your tools from working as well.
Trekking Shoes has typically been used in aggressive two-prize archetypes, but sometimes made its way into other archetypes just as a level of added consistency. There are quite a lot of cards aggressive decks will be sad to see go this rotation, and Trekking Shoes is definitely up there. There aren't a huge amount of ways of burning the deck with items anymore, and this, combined with things like Greninja and Pokestop as well as Lumineon, means that many of these turbo decks will have to slow down significantly and may end up having to play at the pace of some of the evolution decks instead.
Thornton is a really interesting supporter card. It's found its way into a number of archetypes, most recently in a number of Stage 2 decks, to bounce back from bad or aggressive openings from your opponents, from some spread attackers, or some potential Dusknoir plus spread damage combinations that we can see from the likes of Dragapult. Or of course, the dreaded Kieran play from a Regidrago V-Star. At the same time, a number of combo strategies utilised it to actually brute force their own Dusknoir into play as well, to have some really explosive turns. It's also worth noting that this card can be used to fix your prize map by removing multi-prize Pokemon and switching them for a single prizer to deny your opponent's late-game Boss's Orders opportunities. Overall, one of those really sneaky cards that can always create gotcha moments for your opponents that we are unfortunately no longer able to utilise.
Irida is a supporter that, similar to Arven, often helped weave together combos, usually getting Radiant Greninja plus a key item card like Poffin, Nest Ball, or Earthen Vessel. Since Greninja and Palkia are also rotating, and we do still have Arven in the format, this isn't hugely impactful, but Irida definitely saw a huge amount of success in its time in Standard, and sometimes decks were even able to weave in an Irida package just if they were playing Greninja and Lumineon V alone.
Pokestop is another massive loss, and a big landscape shift really in how we're looking towards stadium cards. Losing Pokestop, losing Trekking Shoes, Losing Radiant Greninja, all of this combined really makes the turbo engine that we've seen many archetypes utilize over the last few months completely extinct. We have a huge number of decks that utilize that discard pile for their energy acceleration. Of course, Night Stretcher is a fantastic item card that works superbly with the Pokestop, and we're losing out on that combination. So to me, it looks like we have a real lack of reach in the next format, where our individual support at every turn is going to be that much more vital, and our onboard draw power from our abilities is going to be critical as well.
In terms of tools, Forest Sealstone is a huge one. It gave every deck the option for a computer search at some point during the game if there wasn't a better V-Star for them to be using, and it paired perfectly with the setup V Pokemon in Rotom and Luminion that helped Stage 2 decks actually get into the game. It was also used by aggressive archetypes to try and push their way to a KO turn 1, or could secure checkmate board states alongside Pheasantipity EX, meaning that cards like Iono didn't have much impact. With Forest as well as Luminion and Rotom rotating, Arven engines and Stage 2 decks in general look to be hurt the most, but there's a huge amount of decks that will be sad to see Forest Sealstone rotate.
For special energy, double turbo energy is massive as well. This was integral for a number of Arceus variants for a number of years, but most recently has been great alongside Terrapagos EX, both for the Noctowl builds as well as the more recent Trolley and Poison package lists. It looks as though for acceleration, we're going to have to be far more specific within our own archetypes here, looking towards Glass Trumpets, Electric Generators, or some abilities to help us out to ramp our energy within our decks, rather than have the sort of universal catch-all for those handful of Pokemon that can utilize the 2 colorless attack cost.
Onto some other notable specific set losses for each of the sets rotating, though ones that aren't quite as impactful as the ones outlined so far. Kicking off with Brilliant Stars, we have Arceus V-Star. This was the Pokemon that introduced us to the V-Star mechanic, but hasn't seen a huge amount of play recently. However, across the board, Arceus had a huge amount of partners and spawned multiple successful archetypes that won all tiers of tournaments. Both Raichu V and Raikou V are rotating, both big losses for Miraidon, particularly Raikou, which has been very successful recently in the Area 0 builds of Miraidon to help you achieve one-hit KOs on EX and V-Star Pokemon early in the game, with Raichu being able to get into Stage 2 EX Pokemon damage ranges with the likes of Magneton and Electric Generator. Fire decks lose Entei V and Magma Basin, a cheap attacking combination of cards that often meant fire decks could get into the game quite early, and had a little bit of supplementary draw power as well. Onto the supporters, and Team Yell's Cheer, Roseanne's Backup, Sharon's Care, and Cynthia's Ambition all saw success during their time in Standard, in specific decks here and there. And Collapse Stadium also rotates. A stadium that served as both a disruption option for your opponent, and a healing option for your damaged 2-prize Pokemon.
Within the Astral Radiance expansion, we lose Regigigas and Regidrago. Regigigas was a powerful 1-prize archetype at one point, and the Regidrago is a decent draw option when you have Latias within your list, so that's no longer something we're going to be able to pivot into to gain a few additional cards. Quick note on Togepi, this was the optimal one within Golden Go, and that's no longer an option now. You could use this 10 heal to offset some Dragapult math, but that's no longer possible. Oranguru V was basically the enabler for the Clorf Trolley archetype, as getting this Pokemon into the active then gets your Forest Sealstone straight into the Trolley, and now you're popping off, whilst grabbing that additional tool whether you required the Booster Capsule or the Mochi to do the exact math you were looking for. There's a handful of interesting V and V-Star Pokemon. We lose Luxray V, which is good for the controlling Pidgeot decks, Weirdeer, which found its way into Lugia, Darkrai V-Star, which was decent in some Roaring Moon builds and was a niche 1/1 line in some other lists. Roxanne is one of those comeback supporter cards that we are unfortunately losing. We still have Iono in format, of course, but this served a really nice niche to ensure that you ended on large hand sizes whilst also disrupting the opponent. Really critical for a handful of archetypes that didn't have their own fantastic inbuilt draw. We lose the Silene supporter, which is a massive piece within that Infinite Loop combination with that Palpad and Team Yelcheer to ensure that you would never deck out, whilst also recovering resources, so even just playing one copy within your list could be spammed in whatever matchup you required it. We lose Dark Patch, which is really good energy acceleration for the Roaring Moon EX. We lose Switchcart, which was a nice bonus for the basic builds to have that little bit of inbuilt healing. That math fixing most recently has been a big deal with Monkey Dories roaming around as well as Dragapults, so it is going to be a big loss. Featherball was a great card that could cherry pick Pidgeot without having to discard cards from hand, especially if you were utilising a Noctowl engine. And I'm surprisingly sad about cancelling Cologne leaving the format. This was like a really easy answer card to get around lots of walling Pokemon, of course. So now whenever we're going to be building decks, we have to think about what walling Pokemon we have answers to and adapt accordingly, with physical Pokemon making it into the list instead. But of course, Cologne was also used for more nefarious plans, where opponents would brute force their bench snipes around the Manaphy ability. The Temple of Sinnoh definitely served its purpose in a Lugia format, and also chipped in against some double turbo energy lists. And to my surprise, the super effective glasses also had a pretty interesting cameo in some Lost Zone box decks.
Onto Lost Origin, and there are a handful of V Pokemon that rotate that have seen success recently. Delphox V in the Gouging Fire deck, Hisuian Electrode V at times as a Charizard counter in the Claw of Poison decks, and Pidgeot V, a universal way of avoiding deck out. Both Hisuian Zoroark V-Star and Magnezone V-Star rotates as a couple of niche V-Stars that have seen flash-in-the-pan success, as well as Snorlax and Buffalant from this set, two powerful colourless attackers that have both been used to success in the past. Bayonet also rotates, a card that has seen a little bit of success here and there, able to recover a supporter for you whilst lost zoning himself, and notably Tempting Trap Mawile rotates, a card often looked towards as a splashable way of abusing a low amount of switch cards in decks. Both Radiant Hisuian Sneasler and Radiant Gardevoir rotate, nowhere near as impactful as Radiant Greninja, but very important to the success of their specific decks. And finally, a couple of notable trainers in energy in Gift Energy, Misfortune Sisters, Arizu, Lost City, and Box of Disaster all rotating.
In Silver Tempest, we lose a couple of Radiant Pokemon. The Radiant Alakazam was sort of the go-to option for Dragapults, so they're going to have to be adapting. Radiant Serena never really saw a huge amount of play, but was another benched basic Pokemon that could manipulate damage that you were receiving. We lose Cobalion, which was sometimes a tech Pokemon to help reach on Charizard EX. We lose Articuno, which was like a one-hit wonder for one weekend where a number of people cashed in with Palkia for some paralysis shenanigans with Emergency Jelly. And even Alolan Vulpix had some great highlight moments as well, alongside Arceus. We lose the Worker Supporter, so we lose a little bit of potential Stadium Bump. We lose Capturing Aroma. It was never a powerful card, but it just happened to be good enough in Lugia. And that Emergency Jelly card had some highlights with Articuno. It was decent with Roaring Moon. And don't forget, a handful of Gardevoir builds also played this when we had Shining Arcana.
And finally, onto the subsets, and we lose Pokemon Go Zapdos. This was a card that was in and out of Miraidon, but ultimately helped Iron Hands EX, Raichu V, and even Miraidon itself reach key KOs that were otherwise inaccessible, as well as being a non-rulebox Pokemon attacker too. And Crown Zenith brought Zamazenta and Kyogre, two more one-prize attackers that haven't been seen recently, but both have seen success here and there.
Now that we've discussed the main cards that are exiting the format, let's see what's left and try and unearth how we're going to be building our archetypes with the remaining card pool. Starting off with some of the best EX Pokemon that can help us get into the game. Squawkabilly EX is a go-to option to see a bunch of cards on the opening turn. Mute EX is a really splashable option, still can be powered up as a decent attacking threat, provided you have enough energy acceleration within your deck. But it's also just an all-star, it's a pivot within your list, and it is a great way to top up on a few cards to give you a little bit of protection against Iono. Pheasantipity EX, going to continue to be that all-star player that goes into a number of decks. Yes, there are still many archetypes that are going to be a bit more crafty with their prize map, using their Monkey Dories, using damage counter placements and counter catchers to take multiple prize turns, but Pheasantipity is still going to be a go-to option. Pidgeot EX might be harder to establish when we no longer have that Arven engine to help us get those Forest Hill Stone candy combinations going, and of course we lose that Rotom, but at the same time, once you do establish that Pidgeot, it is still the best ability that we have access to in the game. And just worth noting that Teal Mask Ogerpon, yes, it's mostly in there for the energy acceleration, but it is still replacing itself with energy, and energy is still easy to filter out of the deck thanks to Earthen Vessel, so it is technically still helping you cycle through and thin out your deck. So even though its primary function isn't necessarily for draw, it is giving you extra reach within your deck.
In terms of the non-EXs, Noctowl looks to be one of the best post-rotation engines, with Fan Rotom and Area Zero backing it up. The Noctowl engine has already seen a huge amount of success in Raging Bolt, as well as being the backbone for the Ogerpon box deck that saw some great success in the recent Champions League. We've even seen the engine feature in other archetypes, such as Charizard EX, in early Japanese results. Tatsugiri also looks like another Pokemon that could thrive from this rotation. We still have rescue boards, so Tatsugiri leads could be much more prominent going forward. Similar to Curlier in the past, Dracloak looks like it's going to be pushing Dragapult as an archetype going forward. It's already doing really well pre-rotation, and as one of the only Stage 2 Pokemon with an inbuilt engine, it also looks to be the best post-rotation Stage 2 deck. We also still have engines such as the Dunsparce, Revavroom, and Dodrio, though none of these have had a huge notable impact in early results in Japanese city leagues.
Moving on to those item cards then, we still actually have a huge amount of Ball Search. Very happy to see that we still have the backbone of Buddy Buddy Poffin, Nest Ball, Ultra Ball. These are still going to be the front runners for the majority of decks, but we also have a handful of other interesting niche ones here as well. Terra Orb can be great for some Terra EXs. The Techno Radar is great for the future Pokemon. So we're definitely not short on Ball Search. We're also fortunate to keep almost all of the recovery options. We have Night Stretcher, we have Pal Pad for supporters, we have Super Rod in here as well, so we have plenty of items still available in that regard. The hammers are still in format, although it doesn't feel like it's that powerful right now, with alternate win condition decks being far less concerned about your resources and more about the walls that they can throw up against you instead. It's also worth noting that Energy Switch is going nowhere, so we do retain that sort of universal acceleration option combined with the Teal Mask Ogerpon EX.
When looking at the supporters, we still have plenty of great options. Most of the rotating supporters are utility supporters rather than consistency ones, and a lot of these have kind of been replaced anyway. Things like Iono already phasing out the likes of Roxanne, it means that most of the consistency supporters we lose aren't too impactful. We still have Professor's Research and Carmine to give raw dig to decks, and Research will likely still be the backbone of a lot of archetypes, particularly the two prize aggressive archetypes like Miraidon, Archaludon, and Ceruledge. Iono will still be a staple in high accounts in the slower archetypes, and will still be universally used in most decks as it is at the moment. However, some decks may return to using Judge as a means of disrupting the opponent alongside two prize attackers. Of course, ancient decks still have Professor Starter's Vitality, and we still have Morty and Explorer's Guidance to have additional raw draw supporters for any decks that want to play more than just 4 research. Stage 2 decks will still potentially use Arvon, that the lack of Forest Sealstone and V Pokemon means that there'll be more TM evolution likely in these decks. And we also still have things like Cypher Maniac's Code Breaking, so any decks that have on-board draw may be able to utilise this supporter too.
Moving away from consistency and more towards utility, the boss's orders, of course, they're still here, so we still have great control over our opponent's bench. We still have those great picking up effects like Penny and Churro, as well as a couple decent switching effects like Kieran and Surfer from a supporter form, giving us some nice healing, board fixing, and mobility supporters are abundant. Crispin is looking like a really useful supporter card to again provide some more universal energy acceleration, and let's face it, we're in a Monkey Dory world, so any deck that can afford to float an attachment to put on a Monkey Dory is a big deal next format. There's still a decent number of supporter cards that can recover our Pokemon as well, so if we are concerned about Budulok, this is something to be concerned about. We have Miriam, we have Lana's Aid, and if you're in the Psychic archetypes, you also have Tulip as an option as well. As for controlling players, you actually have a decent chunk of supporters to look towards. We have Eri, we have Zerosic's Machinations, Erica's Invitation, and even Giovanni's Charisma, which is a really solid foundation and versatile combination of supporters, which will allow the controlling decks to probably still find a way next format. Lastly, we still have Briar, still a terrifying card, still a big boast for the Terrastal builds as well. Yes, it's harder to find, potentially with Luminion, but the archetypes that utilize Briar already had great cherry-picking options anyway, via Noctowl, via Pidgeot, so still going to be worthwhile in a number of Terra decks.
There's still plenty of universally good stadiums available in standard post-rotation. Beach Court seems like a natural inclusion to decks that were playing Pokestop, as these often focused on basic-centric strategies. As mentioned, Noctowl looks powerful, and Area Zero will push these engines to be even better post-rotation, and Stage 2 decks may switch to Artisan, making up for the fewer good turn 1 options in these types of decks. Finally, Jamming Tower becomes one of our only ways of interacting with tool cards in the format, meaning that it could see play just to keep these in check.
I think tools are one of the most interesting talking points actually post-rotation. We lose Lost Vacuum, which is kind of one of the better removal options, and we're left with Ruffian, a supporter card, and Jamming Tower, which isn't ideal in decks that want to utilize their own tools, and is probably required in high counts to be able to utilize it at the right time, which might actually open the floodgate for some more passive defensive tools, the likes of hit point buffs from Charms and Capes, or something like a Heavy Baton could be a more useful option on the likes of Iron Hands EX, where you can throw those energies back to continue a chain of powerful attackers. Of course, there are still some great A-spec tools in there as well, the Sparkling Crystal, the Maximum Belt. There's even the likes of Survival Brace, which looks much more dangerous in the next set, with a lot less removal potentially. With setup decks losing the potential to use Rotom V to end their turn, I think a lot of them will be looking towards TM Evolution instead. Arven generally feels weaker because his consistency is dipping without Forest Seal Stone anymore, but he still feels versatile enough with the things we do have in formats that he's still going to see a decent amount of play, I would guess.
Onto the special energy, and rotation opens up room for more creative and powerful special energy to be printed going forward. The lack of a double colourless energy style effect may mean something similar is on the horizon, but for now there aren't too many ways of powering up double colourless energy attack costs outside of Trumpet on colourless types, Crispin and Energy Switch. Jet Energy and Luminous Energy still have the most potential other than Legacy and Neo Upper as Ace spec options, and we still have the likes of Boomerang Energy, Medical Energy, Mist Energy, and most importantly Reversal Energy for specific decks and strategies. And finally, as it's already been alluded to, we keep all of the Ace specs in format. It's still likely that the mostly played ones currently are going to continue to be the most played, things like Prime Catcher, Unfair Stamp, and Trolley, but we've already seen some surprising early results from the likes of Poker Vital A, meaning that pretty much every A spec could potentially be on the table.
Now let's start getting into more detail about which decks are going to be surviving and how they're going to have to adapt with the big losses that they have to suffer from rotation. Starting off with Charizard EX then, this loses so much of its early game support. It loses Luminion to help get those supporters, the Rotom and Forest Seal Stone, which gets you into games as well as getting you into your stage 2s initially. And it means that ultimately Arven just isn't that linchpin that it has been in the pre-rotation meta that gets you going just from one supporter use. It looks like the adaptations for Charizard are going to be branching off into different directions because you lose that consistency and the current builds that we know. Instead, you could look towards TM Evolution and have Drakloak to back up your Charizard, and then you have a combination of a very high damage output late game option, as well as Dragapult, which can give you some good early game control. There's also the potential for a Noctowl based build that utilizes Terapagos as well, as a potential backup attacker, but ultimately just to unlock your abilities early, so that Noctowl can dual seek towards those candy combinations that you need so desperately to get your Charizard online.
Raging Bolt seems to be the early leader in terms of City League results coming out of Japan. It didn't have the best conversion rate at the first Champions League, but it's consistently winning City League after City League, primarily with the Noctowl engine. Noctowl and Area Zero look to fill the gaps left by Greninja, Trekking Shoes and Pokestop, meaning that the deck still looks to be one of the best aggressive decks in the format. We've seen some very minor success from Noctowl Raging Bolt pre-rotation, but in terms of traditional Ogerpon builds, there doesn't look to be another way to play it.
So technically we do still have Terapagos, but it does lose double turbo energy, and we haven't seen many successful builds of Glass Trumpet, just because we have to play so many energy, and we also lose Radiant Greninja, right? So having the discard synergies with Vessels and Ultra Balls are going to be a real hassle to really get this attack rolling. So it's looking more and more likely that Terapagos is going to be more of a bit part player in the format, and far less of an attacking threat.
Archaludon EX ends up losing its main current partner in Dialga V-Star, but does gain Hopzation, a new aggressive option for the archetype. Hopzation potentially gives you some earlier pressure during the game, as well as a much higher damage cap, something traditionally Archaludon has struggled with. We'll have to wait and see whether the archetype becomes very Zacian focused, meaning that Archaludon becomes a bit part player, or whether it still ends up being an attacking presence in the format. Archaludon doesn't lose a huge amount of cards, but the loss of Radiant Greninja will definitely be felt, given that the deck's draw options are naturally quite limited. Things like Reveroom or Dunsparce have potential, but it's unlikely that they're going to be the most successful builds.
Roaring Moon EX loses a lot. Radiant Greninja was so vital to unlock that Sada package, but we also lose the Pokestops, the Trekking Shoes, Dark Patch of course as well. That's a lot of the acceleration, that's a lot of the boast of Roaring Moon EX in the first place. So it's looking more and more obvious that there are going to be better aggressive attackers than Roaring Moon. Some basic toolboxes utilising Energy Switch and Ogerpon seem to be out ahead of this one right now.
Miraidon is probably the turbo deck that is hurt the least by rotation, given that Miraidon itself, as well as Electric Generator and key attackers like Iron Hands, remain in the format. Keeping Magneton 2 means that at least once during the game you'll be able to set up a powerful attacker, though Raichu V and Raikou V rotating really limits the suite of attackers you can use. It doesn't look like there are many great ways for Miraidon to be able to take big Stage 2 knockouts, meaning that it looks much weaker in the late game against the likes of Iono. Naturally, Miraidon is another deck that sometimes played Radiant Greninja, and therefore is hurt by the lack of this draw engine too.
Surely Gardevoir EX cannot survive another rotation. Refinement is gone. Now it's no longer going to have its draw as its main boast, and it's not going to be anywhere near as defensively capable as it has been in the last few formats. But that said, you still have really powerful single prize attackers. You have Screamtail, you have Drifloon, Gardevoir EX can still be really nasty with a Dreadbrain from Monkey Dory. I feel like this archetype's actually going to go through a transition where it's no longer the defensive deck. Instead, you're going to be trying to yeet as many energy into the discard as possible and lean into those single prize Pokemon to be a headache for the opponent. We could try and recreate some of the magic with refinement as well if we go heavy on Artisan and have to Dunsparce as a thin package within the deck. It's no doubt a cheap imitation of what we know right now, but because of those single prize Pokemon and tool removal being in such a weird place post-rotation, I think there could still be a chance for these single prizes to continue to get into the mix with Gardevoir at the helm.
Onto Gouging Fire, and this looks to be an archetype that's hit pretty hard by rotation. The deck loses both Delphox V and Entei V, two attackers that gave the archetype a lot of texture, meaning that it wasn't just a big damage one-shot deck. We also lose Magma Basin, which means the only way to power up a Gouging Fire in one turn is through the use of Energy Switch. The losses for Gouging Fire are very similar to Roaring Moon, so there doesn't look to be too much between these decks going forward.
Next up, we have a handful of decks that really don't change too much. Iron Thorns loses double Turbo Energy, which is a big deal, but you can still play Turbo Energize from the Arven package that you already utilize, so I think it's still reasonable. And we can just even weave in Crispin if we have to. That ability is still such a headache for a number of lists, so I think Iron Thorns is still going to be more or less okay. Let's not forget, of course, that you can still combine this card with Dragapult if ever we really are looking towards its ability once again.
Ceruledge only really loses Radiant Greninja as a core card, which, whilst impactful, could sometimes be mitigated by aggressive draws with Carmine and Squawkabilly. Lately, the deck played Palkia V-Star to give it more options, but going forward the archetype will have to go back to a more turbo, heavier energy build, trying to make Ceruledge a threat as early as possible.
Surprisingly enough, Conkeldurr doesn't lose a huge amount. You do lose that Radiant Hisui and Sneasler, so a bit of damage modification, and you lose the help from those V Pokemon to get you into games, but ultimately the core is still here, you can still be this powerful zero energy attacking deck, and the majority of your supporters are still intact. So this could continue to be a decent trolley-based deck, utilising single prize Pokemon, which inherently gets you around a number of the annoying walling cards in format as well, which surprisingly carves out a nice niche for this card.
And finally we have Dragapult, arguably the biggest winner of rotation. Similar to Charizard, Dragapult is another stage 2 that loses the early game cards, meaning that turn 2 Dragapult will be much harder. However, since the introduction of Budjo into the format, most Dragapult players tried to develop a board of multiple Dracloaks before beginning to get aggressive with Phantom Dive. Because the deck has an inbuilt draw engine, it's much more likely to survive rotation compared to the likes of Charizard and Gardevoir. And you always have the potential to high roll into a turn 2 Phantom Dive, which is just as devastating as before. So far in City Leagues, we've still seen it paired with the likes of Xatu, Goldengo, Charizard and Iron Thorns, and it doesn't seem there's a universally agreed best way to play it yet, but the Goldengo build has had some pretty successful results, and whilst it may seem like a mismatch, the pair of attackers cover each other's weaknesses quite well.
I think the big surprise of the Fukuoka Champions League was just how many of these frustrating walling decks made it deep into the tournaments. These really are just decks that have a handful of frustrating cards. Milotics for Rigoraths, Mimikyus and Cornerstone Ogopons, a bunch of different energy and Crispin to stitch it all together to attack with the right one in the right matchup. My jaw was on the floor to see so many Poker Vital A's making it deep into these massive tournaments, but it does go to show that a number of the other top decks in the format really can't cope with the flurry of these frustrating walling mons. So this is going to be a new archetype that we have to contend with and deck build accordingly to respect these cards.
The other new deck to talk about on the block is Feraligatr, a deck that seemingly came out of nowhere but ended up winning the latest Champions League. Feraligatr has a really unique playstyle, utilising attacks on Totodile and Croconaw through the use of Relicanth's ability. You're able to sit behind Mimikyu or Milotic EX to cause frustration for the opponent. All of this while abusing Feraligatr's Torrential Heart ability and moving all the damage over with Monkey Dories on your side of the board. The deck plays like no other in the format, being able to trap, hit and run, hide behind walling Pokemon, but also race against high HP Pokemon, giving opponents a lot to have to play around. Given its aforementioned success at the recent Champions League, this will likely be a deck that a lot of people look towards first in their early testing. Finally, we need to take a look at Journey Together, the set that we'll be releasing alongside Rotation. Journey Together only has a handful of non-specific trainers in the set that aren't related to the new Trainers Pokemon mechanic, but some of these will definitely be worth considering when building post-rotation lists. Super Potion has been reprinted, but is unlikely to be impactful based on the HP change in the game. Tanking archetypes are still likely to use the likes of Penny and Professor Churo's Scenario, and we've even seen some of the wall stall decks use Pokevital A as their ace spec. Exchange Ticket unfortunately doesn't replace Hisui and Heavy Ball, being considerably worse despite not being limited to basic Pokemon. If anything, this will likely be limited to control decks, but realistically this will never be worth one of your 60 card slots. Iris's Fighting Spirit is a reprint of Volkner's Philosophy, which didn't see too much play before and is unlikely to have an impact now, given the suite of supporters we have like Professor's Research, Explorer's Guidance, and Morty's Conviction as raw draw options. One of the best new cards is Brock's Scouting, a brilliant option for evolution decks that allows you to search for basic or evolution Pokemon. This is great as it doesn't fall off in the mid to late game, though without Luminion, these types of supporters are likely going to be hard to find, so we'll have to see if players decide to dedicate deck space to cards like this. Ruffian is another option alongside Jamming Tower to deal with tools, and could definitely be added to the suite of supporter options that controlling archetypes play. Levincia is a powerful new stadium that could be used in New Age Raging Bolt or Goldengo lists outside of just being used in Iono's Belly Bolt decks. And finally we have Spike Energy, an interesting card but one that's unlikely to have large scale impact even with specific synergies like Lycanroc.
Of course, the big news for Journey Together is the Trainers Pokemon returning to the TCG. We're going to be making individual videos covering these in much deeper detail for each of the Trainers Pokemon. But let's briefly go over those now, just in terms of filling the gaps of the format, and how they could interact with other decks as well. The Ends Pokemon doesn't really have a big focus on high damage output, but gains its advantage through the classic consistency. With the trade ability from Ends Zoroark EX, we can discard a card and draw two. The Refinement Curlier may be rotating, but we get it back immediately in the form of this Zoroark. It's also the main attacker in the deck in that it's copying other Ends Pokemon for just 2 Dark Energy. I think the best copy options are Reshiram, which has an outrage attack as well as a stable 170 damage output, and the Darmanitan, which has a very powerful spread damage option of 90 to the active as well as 90 to one of your opponent's bench. And remember, Manaphy's gone of course, so this is going to be hard to stop for the opponent. As for supporting synergies, we have a nice Stadium card which gives us great pivot potential, and we have the Ends PP Up, which is a fantastic item card that provides energy acceleration, helping us maintain our Zoroarks when we're getting one-hit KO'd, or when we're discarding energy for our Darmanitan attack. Don't forget, Darmanitan can also just attack via the reversal energy as well, and is a really solid single prize option that we will look to as an attacking presence, not just being copied by Zoro itself. Because Zoroark's damage output is a little bit lackluster, I think very commonly we're going to see them incorporate the Binding Mochi Pecharunt EX combo, possibly even if they are playing the Ends Castle Stadium card, but it could also give you a different means of moving between your Pokemon, whilst having a nice damage mod to push that awful 170 up to a much more palatable 210 damage. Again, not the most impressive, but always bear in mind that whenever we are getting hit and able to tank, we're going to be doing much more impressive damage outputs, and of course we're going to be cycling many cards, we're going to have inbuilt Iono protection, and we're going to be the one trying to string together these combinations, like Counter Catcher plus Iono, very easily because we will be expanding our hand throughout the game, provided we draw into enough of our Zoroark.
Next up we have Lillie's Pokemon. Lillie's team isn't quite as robust as some of the other trainers in the set, with only Clefairy, Rabombi, and Comfey having cards dedicated to her, but Lillie does have a tool card that helps all 3 of these Pokemon should you choose to play them. The Lillie's Pearl tool card states that any Lillie's Pokemon that has this tool attached gives up 1 less prize when your opponent knocks it out. This means Rabombi and Comfey don't give up prizes at all, but more importantly, Clefairy is a 1 prize Pokemon. Clefairy's decks could play 4 of this card to try and make the opponent go through 4 EX Pokemon for just 4 prizes, or 2 prize archetypes could just play 1 of these, with Lillie's Clefairy as a tech attacker to offset the prize trade. Given we've mentioned how powerful tool cards are in this format, the Lillie's Pearl tool card could be quite a nuisance for some archetypes. Lillie's Clefairy EX itself has 2 key features that mean its impact in the post-rotation metagame is almost guaranteed. The first of which is its ability, Fairy Zone. Fairy Zone gives all Dragon Pokemon in your opponent's side of the board a 2x weakness to Psychic. Whilst Regidrago V-Star is rotating, Dragapult EX looks to be a very strong contender in the new format since it loses very little. With 320 HP and no natural weakness, decks can sometimes struggle to get through Dragapult in 1 hit, but any deck that can weave a Lillie's Clefairy EX and a couple of Psychic Energy in can all of a sudden flip their Dragapult matchup on its head. We've already seen the Ogerpon EX Toolbox deck play Lillie's Clefairy EX to help with the Dragapult matchup, so evidence already exists for its impact in the post-rotation world.
The hop support is really interesting, definitely on the aggressive side. We have a huge number of damage modding cards here. Hop Snorlax is a plus 30, the Postwick Stadium card is a plus 30, and the Hop's Choice Band, a ridiculous tool card, plus 30 damage and a -1 colorless attack cost reduction. That's absolutely absurd. Now Hop's Cramorant, a really powerful single prize Pokemon, can attack for 0 energy, whilst you commit attachments to your other Pokemon. Hop Snorlax even becomes a much more efficient attacking option itself, with Dynamic Press being much more reasonable for a -1 attack cost. And then there's the Hops Zacian EX, which looks like a very dangerous basic Pokemon. That Close Cleave is very often going to be taking out basics whilst also setting up damage on the bench for just 1 energy, or 0 if you find your choice band. And the Brave Slash is a pretty expensive attack for 3 metal and 1 colourless. You deal 240 and next turn you can't use Brave Slash. This actually on paper looks terrible, but then you start piecing together all the modifiers. If you have Snorlax, if you have Postwick, if you have the choice band, that's a plus 90 that you can push, and suddenly you're hitting really impressive numbers and KOing the majority of even stage 2 EXs. Because of that ridiculous attack cost, Hop Zacian is oftentimes finding itself alongside Archaludon, or even a Metang build to try and push that Brave Slash over and over again, or even just to weave it in once in the game to give yourself a bigger burst of damage than something like an Archaludon, which we'll look towards for the majority of turns in the game. There's also the Hops Double, which is a really powerful card just in a vacuum, but could easily work within a Hops deck naturally, trying to recreate the magic of something like a Buzzwole Lycanroc deck, where Zacian is trying to take the role of Buzzwole, and the Hops Double is going to try and take the role of the Lycanroc, in that it's a really handy stage 1 Pokemon that when you evolve, you can pick one of your opponent's bench Pokemon and bring it into the active. An archetype like this that's constantly looking for those extra modifiers, constantly trying to find stadium, bumps, and tool cards, is probably going to have to focus on using draw supporters consistently throughout the game, which means that this double allows you to continue gusting aggressively whilst cycling through your deck as well. The Hops Bag is another nice boast card that can synergize quite well here, in that it can get 2 basic Hops Pokemon directly onto the bench. It's like a Buddy Buddy Poffin, but it's for our Hops Mons, so we can get those into play quickly. Definitely really nice to get excess Wooloo, or just get your main attacker in addition to Snorlax, so that you're immediately doing that extra damage mod. It's also worth noting from a more broad scope is that the Hops Wooloo is a colourless Pokemon with 70 hit points, so it can be picked up with a Fan Rotom as well, so there could be an opportunity for potentially like the Lillie's Clefairy deck to have the Fan Rotom, Noctowl plus Hops Double as a package all in one deck, something I'm going to try and explore.
Finally, we have Iono's Pokemon. Iono brings back the Rain Dance mechanic, with Bellibolt EX's Electro Streamer ability, allowing you to attach as many lightning energy from your hand to your Iono's Pokemon during your turn. Bellibolt can also work as an attacker, with its Thunderous Bolt attack dealing 230 damage for 4 energy, which KOs most important basic EX Pokemon in the game. The deck looks like it will have a solid draw engine too, with Iono's Kilowattrel allowing you to draw until you have 6 cards in hand, provided you discard a lightning energy from Kilowattrel first. Since you can use multiple different Kilowattrel per turn, and you can keep recovering energy to your hand using the aforementioned Levincia Stadium, the deck should consistently be able to take all 6 prizes without having to worry too much about disruption from the likes of Iono. Iono's Voltorb also gives the deck a powerful 1 prize uptrading option, with its Chain Bolt attack dealing 20 damage plus 20 more for each lightning energy attached to all of your Iono's Pokemon. And Bellibolt could even introduce a brand new way of playing Raging Bolt, using Electro Streamer and Energy Switch over the more traditional Ogerpon and Professor Sada's Vitality engine. Rain Dance typically sees success in the formats they're released in, and whilst the deck hasn't made huge waves in the early Japanese meta, it has a really well-rounded core and looks to keep other archetypes honest.
Wrapping things up then, this is undoubtedly one of the biggest rotations of all time, certainly the most important in recent memory. Some of the best aggressive archetypes look to be Raging Bolt, as well as the Noctowl Ogerpon toolbox. There are still plenty of setup-based decks, utilising Pidgeot EX, Noctowl, Dustomer still very powerful, and that TM evolution is becoming more and more of a hard carry for the Stage 2 builds. We certainly have to be concerned by these annoying walling Pokemon. If we don't respect them, you will just end up losing to them. But the bottom line is, this is a monstrous shake-up, a completely new game. Myself and Jack are going to be getting lots of post-row content done, and of course, keep an eye on the streams when it comes out on PTG Live, and we're going to be doing those more in-detail guides for each of the trainers' Pokemon, so keep an eye out on the channel for that. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed this different style of video. Let us know down below what you thought, and we'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.